speaker. Dolita Cathcart is an associate professor of history at Wheaton College, where she has taught a variety of African, African American, and labor and social movements courses since 1996. Dolita obtained her bachelor's degree from Harvard, her master's in American Civilization from UMass Boston, and her doctorate in history from Boston College. While in graduate school, Dolita's research focused on elite African Americans and their contributions to the various civil rights movements of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This work culminated in her dissertation, White Gloves, Black Rebels, The Decline of Elite Black National Political Leadership in Boston, 1870 to 1929. Dolita has appeared in the PBS Independent Lens documentary Birth of a Movement and in the National Geographic documentary series Origins. She is a 5th degree Black Belt in Aikido, which she teaches in Cambridge and Somerville. I'm so glad to have Dolita here with us today. I'm going to turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, Rita, and thank you for inviting me here today. Good afternoon, everybody. The title of my talk is The Gilded Cage, Florida Ruffin Ridley, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, and the Effects of Race, Class, and Gender on the Political Expression of Elite Black Women in Boston from 1890 to 1903. Dressed respectably in somber colors, petticoats, cloche hat, and white gloves, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin sat sedately in the front meeting room of the South End Clubhouse she founded in Boston at 558 Massachusetts Avenue. The building housing the League of Women for Community Service was the old Farewell Mansion, where the previous owners had sheltered fugitive slaves in the basement. After World War I, the club purchased the building as a base to provide services for poor Blacks in the city. The February 28, 1924 annual meeting began with the reading of annual reports and ended with the election of the club's executive officers. The long day and February chill did not deter 128 of the 154 members from attending the meeting. They discussed issues from the mundane to the poignant, like the assessed value of the League's building, a recent membership drive, and the numbers of local Black Boston residents the League assisted over the past year. Some members complained that their social welfare work was exhausting and never ending. There were simply too many residents who needed help and too few dollars to help them. At 82, Ruffin had heard it all before during her long tenure as a radical abolitionist, feminist, and race leader. She was eager to cast her vote for the new leadership. At 1 in the morning, the votes were finally tallied and the meeting was called to a close. On March 13th, 1924, following a brief illness, Ruffin passed away, and with her passing, so ended an era of radical feminist race politics in Boston. Passing the torch to the next generation of race leaders may not have been easy for Ruffin, a native Bostonian used to giving so much to so many. Ruffin was an abolitionist, a journalist, a publisher, and a founder of the Black Women's Club movement, the Boston chapter of the NAACP, a World War I soldiers' comfort unit, and the League of Women for Community Service. She was a Black woman with an 8th grade education, the highest level of education a woman could attain in Boston during her youth. She raised 4 children who all attended college, assisted her husband in his political and judicial career in the city, and also helped found the Massachusetts State Federation of Women's Clubs. This, wrote Ruffin's daughter, Florida Ruffin Ridley, to author Haley Q. Brown, puts her not only as a pioneer in colored club work, but also as a pioneer in white. Ruffin was the leader of radical Black elite women in Boston and embodied the tenets of ideal Black womanhood. She was both a Victorian-era lady and a race woman. Ruffin needed not to worry who would carry her torch of race and gender activism forward into the 20th century. She had her daughter, Florida, who was by her side from birth. Florida Ruffin Ridley was born on January 29, 1861, and died in Toledo, Ohio, on February 25, 1943, at the age of 82. She was a civil rights activist, a teacher, a writer, a suffragist, and co-editor of the Women's Era, along with her mother. The Women's Era was the first Black women's paper in the country. Born in Boston, Florida Ruffin Ridley lived on Charles Street in Boston's West End neighborhood, attended Boston public schools, and graduated from Boston's Teachers College in 1882 and attended Boston University as well, before teaching in the Boston public school system. Ridley was one of 5 children born to George L. and Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. Her career and interest in social activism was influenced by both of her parents. She married folklorist and tailor Ulysses A. Ridley of Boston, and the couple had 2 children, Ulysses Jr. and Constance. Ridley was the second Black teacher to teach in Boston's public schools. She taught at the Grant School from 1880 until she married Ulysses A. Ridley in 1888, who owned a tailoring business in downtown Boston. In those days, married women were not permitted to teach in the public schools. The couple moved to 131 Kent Street in Brookline in 1896 and are believed to be the first Black homeowners in Brookline, and were one of the founders of the Second Unitarian Church in Brookline. Though Ridley was no longer permitted to teach, she was involved in various clubs and organizations around Boston and nationwide. Ridley, who had a special interest in Black history, also co-founded the Society for the Collection of Negro Folklore in 1890 and founded the Society of the Descendants of Early New England Negroes in the 1920s, and continued to write fiction as well. Through her work, Ridley remembered and recognized the contributions of Black Americans past and present. As president of the Society of the Descendants of Early New England Negroes, Ridley wrote in 1929, "The Society's first purpose is to supply what have been called some missing pages in American history, to present the Black men of New England who fought in the French and Indian Wars, who mingled with the white farmers at Lexington to oppose the British, who fought all through the Revolution not as slaves, although they had been brought to America in chains, but as men who worked, fought, and died, not only to obtain their own liberty, but for the liberty of the colonies also." In her works of fiction, Ridley was very interested in Black Americans with multiple heritages, much like her own family. She wrote about how she was ethnically diverse, and in 2 of her short stories, He Must Think It Out and Maria Peters, A Peculiar Woman, Ridley highlights the trauma of racism in the United States. Some believe that her fiction was important in the continuation of the Harlem Renaissance in Boston. As a journalist and essayist, Ridley wrote mainly about Black history and race relations in New England. She contributed to the Journal of Negro History, the Boston Globe, and other periodicals, and also published a number of short stories. She was a member and founder of the Saturday Evening Quill Club, a literary group organized by Boston Post editor and columnist Eugene Gordon in 1925. Fellow members included Pauline Hopkins and Dorothy West. The Saturday Evening Quill, the group's annual journal, published the work of African-American women writers and artists, including Ridley, Helene Johnson, and Lois Jones. Ridley's most important work, much of it done with her mother, was her civil rights advocacy, her fight for the vote, and her anti-lynching work. She was a leader among activist Black women at the time. Though less wealthy Black women took on this work as well, Black elite women were instrumental in founding and leading the clubs, associations, and organizations that struggled for equality and equity for both Black Americans and all women in the nation. The decade of the 1890s saw St. Pierre Ruffin and her daughter Florida Ruffin Ridley turn Boston into a major site for Black women's institution building. The 1890s were an important period of time for Black Americans. Throughout the post-war years, Southern states were passing Black codes to restrict the rights of Black Americans and to curtail the success so many accomplished during the short period of time known as the Reconstruction era. Black success during Reconstruction made it obvious that white supremacist rhetoric during and after slavery was ended was false. The entire Ruffin family attempted what they could to address these Black codes as they were passed and to stop the Klan, but to no avail. By the 1890s, many Black women activists believed the failure in halting and reversing Jim Crow legislation was the fault of men, and they, Black women, would have to take on the fight. This mother-daughter team first established the Women's Era Club, a civic organization for Black women with the motto to make the world better. They formed the club after hearing Ida B. Wells speak in New York before she left for England in an anti-lynching campaign. The Women's Era Club was not the only club inspired by Wells. Elite and middle-class Black women across the country created clubs to fight racial discrimination, end lynching, and assist one another in their endeavors. A year after founding the club, they also published The Women's Era, the first national monthly publication for Black women, and convened the first conference of Black women held at Berkeley Hall, which led to the formation of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in 1896. This army of organized women occupied public spaces and made their voices heard time and again, despite threats of retaliation and violence. On May 20th, 1899, for example, Ruffin Ridley and Mary Evans Wilson, a Black civil rights leader, led an interracial group of 200 protesters in an anti-lynching demonstration at Chickering Hall. In rousing speeches, they called for justice and called out politicians who failed to defend Black rights. Moving to Brookline in 1896, Florida Ridley continued her involvement in community and activist work in the 20th century. Most notably, she participated in the local anti-lynching and women's suffrage movements. Florida Ridley also supported the education and uplift of the Black community. She served on the council of the Robert Gould Shaw House, a community center and settlement house, during its foundational years. Joining other Black women community leaders, Ridley helped form the local Soldiers' Comfort Unit, which became the League of Women for Community Service in 1919 after World War I. Elite Black women in Boston responded to internal gender dynamics and tensions endemic in Black patriarchal society with a Black feminist sensibility. They sought to create an ethnic and racial plurality of male and female social activists to address the nation's challenges, thereby rejecting becoming casualties of racial and gender discrimination. Though faced with the more restrictive gender roles of middle-class women vis-a-vis working-class women at the time, Black middle-class women in Boston nonetheless transgressed the imposed social, political, and economic restrictions of their race, class, and gender in order to contribute to the betterment of the larger society. The prevailing constructs of race, class, and gender in Gilded Age and Progressive Era America were expanded by those women to support their call for radicalism in response to Jim Crow, to support the early attempts of Black nationalism in founding the National Association of Colored Women, and to support the later turn to social welfare projects in addressing the needs of a growing Black population mired in poverty and too few opportunities prior, during, and after World War I. Ruffin's and Ridley's story, and that of their politicized cohorts, is a story of the interconnectivity of race, class, and gender in Boston, then known as the least racist city in the nation. Gender and gendering affected the political expressions of elite Blacks that struggled against racial discrimination after the Civil War. Black women without access to the gendered attributes of citizenship, honor, military, service, and the franchise adapted and radicalized late Victorian era true womanhood to suit their and their community's needs. The role gender played on political expression in Black communities has been examined by a number of historians in recent years. Barbara Andelson's examination of the interstructuring of sexism and racism in America concluded that the tenets of true womanhood were sexist, racist, and classist. Boston's elite Black women activists responded by adapting true womanhood to include their feminist-inspired anti-racist and uplift work among the poor. Hazel V. Carby agreed that Black women reconstructed 19th century sexual ideologies, thereby producing an alternate discourse of Black womanhood, what I term ideal Black womanhood. Doing so freed Black women from the spirit-binding corsets of reigning social constructs, releasing them to address the worsening conditions of Black Americans. Claudia Tate further illustrated that the optimistic novels written by Black women during the 1890s were all written within the context of politicized domesticity. The ideal Black women bridged the private and public spheres. They were educated, race-conscious, often worked outside of the home, and vocal role models of respectable political activism. By the mid-1890s, the ideal Black woman's politicized domesticity was expressed through the Black Women's Club movement. In addition to Black women's clubs, Black churches were another venue where middle-class Black women exercised their vision of a broader democracy. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham uncovered a distinct discourse of resistance, a feminist theology in the Black Baptist Church, which served as a rallying institution for anti-racist and social welfare work. Like the women of the Black Club movement, Higginbotham found that the convention movement in the Black Baptist Church was led by a race-conscious vanguard imbued with the class values of Victorian America. Higginbotham, in introducing the effects of the politics of respectability on Black women, noted that the Black middle class assimilated dominant cultural norms to counter popular white characterizations of Blacks. During the late 19th century, Black elite women did more than just assimilate dominant late Victorian era cultural norms. They changed them to suit their broad political agenda by including a public persona that allowed for their political expression. Additionally, respectability was the lingua franca of middle-class and elite America. Elite and middle-class Black Americans no more assimilated dominant cultural norms than working-class whites entering the middle class. The expansion of middle-class respectability through uplift work with poorer Black Americans was politicized because of the one drop of blood rule in America, which did not result in the recognition of stratified Black economic classes. Other former slave societies in the Americas recognized in varying degrees coloreds from Blacks and elites from the poor, thereby creating separate racialized social and economic castes. American racism was more democratic in not recognizing Black class differences. As a result, elite and middle-class Blacks were prevented from becoming a separate caste of Black Americans, which resulted in elites maintaining their interests in the welfare of their poorer cousins in order to counter popular racist characterizations that appeared to stymie Black equality. The politics of respectability was a thoughtful but desperate attempt to halt racist white terrorism and Jim Crow discrimination, but an approach that did show some positive results. In Tennessee, for example, Goings and Page found that middle-class women won cases against the Memphis Street Railway Company from 1890 to 1920 when they could prove insults to their respectability, whereas working-class men had to prove they were so badly injured that they could no longer work for their white bosses. Middle-class respectability and gender created space for Black women to contest racism in the South and in the North, but the threat of lynching constrained Black men from making the same appeal to respectability in the South and the West. In Boston, the failure of Black men to halt Jim Crow led to the rise of Black women's political leadership in the 1890s and to the Black Women's Club movement. Black women drew their moral authority for this leadership from their adaptation of late Victorian true womanhood, from the derived optimism they felt as a result of Black triumphalism after the Civil War, and because they were the last remaining line of defense in Black communities battling racial discrimination. The shift in Black gendered leadership in the South, examined by Glenda Gilmore, notes the same shift occurred in North Carolina, but under different circumstances. Gilmore shows that middle-class Black women's political activities in North Carolina were the direct result of the social, political, and economic emasculation of Southern Black males. Gilmore believed that Blacks embraced middle-class values such as thrift, temperance, piety, and education in an attempt to win white acceptance. African Americans needed white support to win full citizenship rights. This support could only be gained if white racial consciousness changed. Black respectability was one strategy Black activists used to slowly change white views and fears of African Americans. That whites imbued these middle-class values with dreams of white supremacy at home and abroad should not diminish their meaning relative to the Black middle class. Class mattered in the United States, and wealth translated into opportunities that elite Blacks wanted to share with their children, with poor Blacks, and with whites. Historians of Black political leadership in the 20th century focused on Black urban professionals after the Great Migration, but ignored the contributions of the native-born Black elites. Like Higginbotham's subjects, elite Blacks in Boston subscribed to the politics of respectability. But elite Blacks in Boston were not just assimilating white class values. They were already elites possessing these values and viewed themselves as representatives of Black potential, freed from the most debilitating forms of racial discrimination. In July 1888, elite Black women in Boston had a chance to exercise their growing political voice. The National League, a Boston-based Black male organization, invited the women to participate in a ladies' night, where women were given control of the meeting during the League's final gathering before adjourning for the summer. Edwin G. Lewis surrendered the gavel to Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, quote, who presided for the remainder of the evening. Ruffin's first order of business was to criticize the men of the League from a woman's perspective. She claimed the men were spending far too much time in their meetings arguing over arcane parliamentary techniques instead of getting any real work done. From Ruffin's point of view, the men had failed to halt the spread of Jim Crow, and now it was the duty of Black women to address the continuing humiliation of racial discrimination. Maria L. Baldwin, a Cambridge-based educator, also read from a paper she penned on the part that women is to play in the great uplifting of the race. Elite Black women in Boston were disappointed with the leadership of Black male organizations in their attempt to reverse the erosion of Black rights in the late 19th century. The Black male convention movement and organizations like the National League seemed unable to work cooperatively, deliberatively, and successfully to protect Black Americans from the expansion of Jim Crow. Fannie Barrier Williams, writing in the Women's Era Journal a few short years later, cautioned Black women not to structure their clubs like Black men's organizations, quote, whose innumerable conventions, councils, and conferences during the last 25 years have all begun with talk and ended with talk. Anna Julia Cooper stated that Black women were, quote, the fundamental agency under God in the regeneration of the race, as well as the groundwork and starting point of its progress upward. Black women entered the public sphere to fight for their and their families' rights, believing they were agents of change and models of respectability with a duty to do more than just rehabilitate Black manhood. The catalyst for founding Black women's clubs was political. White Southern newspapers regularly published articles reprinted in Northern papers reporting on the lynching of Black men for the, quote, crime of outrage against white women, namely rape. Discriminatory reporting was a problem for Black elite activists in the North. If Black elites defended, quote, guilty Black criminals, then their reputations would suffer. This all changed in 1892 when Ida B. Wells unearthed evidence behind most of the publicized lynchings in the South. Her investigation ignited a movement to halt and criminalize lynching, showing Black citizens were terrorized and murdered simply for the crime of being Black. In other words, there were no rapes. On February 6, 1892, Ida B. Wells, preparing to take her anti-lynching campaign to England in hopes of winning support there, spoke at a fundraiser held in her honor in New York City that was attended by Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, Florida Ruffin Ridley, Victoria Earle Matthews, Dr. Susan McKinney, and others. After Wells finished speaking, the women called for the formation of Black women's clubs. Wells' anti-lynching campaign gave Black activists cover to combat spurious articles detailing Black male violence in the South. She also addressed what had been heretofore a taboo subject since the times of slavery, the rape of Black women by white men. Wells' anti-lynching campaign provided Black women with the moral ammunition they needed to encourage the founding of Black women's clubs across the nation to combat lynching, racial discrimination, and attacks on Black respectability. Black women's clubs, believed Ridley, must have more than a purpose. It must have a program, one that is workable and within the capacities of its members, one that will interest and inspire. Ridley believed such a program was absent in Black male organizations. Ida B. Wells' activism proved a balm to what many Black women believed were ineffectual Black male organizations during the late 19th century. The protest and voting irregularities through legislative means failed. The South was sending Democrats to Congress and Republican majority districts, while Northern Republicans grew disinterested in protecting Black rights because Black votes were no longer honestly tallied in southern states. Black communities needed a catalyst to refocus Black protests, to address the perfidy of Republicans and the bigotry of Southern Democrats. Wells' anti-lynching campaign proved to be just that catalyst. Florida Ruffin Ridley, reminiscing in 1936 over the founding of the Black Women's Club movement, stated that in 1895, members of Boston's Women's Era Club were, quote, talking, as is usual, upon the ever-smoldering race problem. Behind them were those promising days which followed the Civil War. The women were both impressed and disheartened over the changes of the past quarter century. They discussed President Hayes, Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan, lynchings, and Negro disfranchisement. Quote, this little group of colored women, wrote Ridley, had mingled too closely and seen and felt too strongly the power of that small, invincible group of abolitionists, that had pitted itself against the world and a mighty civilization, not to be inspired by its courage and ready to take a lesson from it. The women also, quote, learned a lesson from how white women had been organizing themselves in clubs to develop their potentialities and to obtain more influence in their communities. As a result, Black women organized clubs that led to the call to the Convention of the Colored Women of America in Boston, in Massachusetts in July 1895. The women did what they could, but Ridley wrote they hardly made a dent in the direful need, but clearing the way for larger efforts. Their emphasis, wrote Ridley, was in helping people to help themselves. Ridley's mother, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, struggled for Black and women's rights in Boston, the city of her birth, for her entire adult life. She was reared in a home of refinement and culture and comparative luxury. She was born in Boston on August 31st, 1842, the sixth of 9 children. Her father, John St. Pierre, was a Martiniquois clothier of French, Indian, and African ancestry, and her mother, Eliza Mahinik, was an Englishwoman from Cornwall. On June 30th, 1858, she married George Lewis Ruffin, a barber from Richmond, Virginia. He would become the first African-American graduate of Harvard Law School, the first Black elected to the Boston Common Council, and years later, on November 19th, 1883, when he was confirmed as a Charlestown Municipal Court judge, the first African-American north of the Mason-Dixon line to hold a judicial office higher than magistrate. Immediately after their wedding, the couple set sail for Liverpool, England, intending to raise their children in a country where slavery had already been abolished. But they soon returned to America, prepared to take part in the struggle for Black freedom. They had 5 children: Hubert St. Pierre Ruffin, Florida Yates Ruffin, Charles Stanley Ruffin, George Lewis Ruffin Jr., and Robert Ruffin, who would later die. During the Civil War, Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin helped to recruit soldiers for the 54th and 55th Massachusetts regiments and volunteered her time working with the U.S. Sanitary Commission, a relief agency that cared for sick and wounded Union soldiers and promoted clean and healthy conditions in the Union Army camps. Moreover, she dedicated her efforts to performing charitable work. In January 1875, for example, she established and headed the West End Relief Association, an organization whose goal was to provide a home to destitute children. And in late April 1879, she helped form and became the founding president of the Colored Women's Refugee Aid Society. Its purpose was to offer assistance to poor Black refugees fleeing the post-Reconstruction South. A year after attending Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching address in New York City, Ruffin Ridley and Baldwin founded the Women's Era Club, one of the first Black women's club in the nation. And Ruffin served as its only president until the club disbanded in 1903. In 1894, the Women's Era Journal, in an article about its founding, reported that Ida Wells was creating so much interest in her crusade against lynching, it was a good time to carry out the club idea. Ridley and Baldwin were both educators, and their background was influential in setting the first goals of the club, to open kindergartens in Boston and Georgia. Ridley wrote in the club minutes published in their journal that the 3 women, Ruffin, Baldwin, and Ridley, did not want a narrowly focused club limited by race alone. Quote, "It cannot but be admitted that we, as a race, have too frequently limited ourselves to this field, with the result of contracting our vision, enfeebling our impulses, and weakening our powers. We, the women of the Women's Era Club, enter the field to work hand in hand with women, generally for humanity and humanity's interest, not the Negro alone, but the Chinese, the Hawaiian, the Russian Jew. The oppressed everywhere are subjects for our consideration. Not the needs of the colored women, but women everywhere are our interests." Ridley went on to state that the idea of forming Black women's clubs was to bring women together and organize, not just for race work alone, but for work along all the lines that make for women's progress. Ridley admitted, though, that the actual work done by the club since its formation is small, but most promising. Though racial relations were only getting worse during this time, these women and others created a new political paradigm, a domesticated form of political engagement that presaged the later 20th century development of the social welfare state. Organized women, believed Ruffin, were a benefit to the larger society through their social welfare and reform work, but also to individual Black women as well. Quote, "This organization of colored women," wrote Ruffin, "are brought more closely in touch with the world and the great questions of the day, and are enabled to give a helping hand to those less favored." Ruffin saw the club as a means of educating and expanding the sphere of influence of women. In addition to founding kindergartens and addressing the needs of poor Black women in Boston, the Women's Era Club also produced a newsletter of the same name that was expanded to a monthly broadsheet on March 24, 1894. The Women's Era Journal was a necessary instrument in promoting ideal Black womanhood, in the development of Black women's clubs, and in maintaining links with similarly minded women across the country. Though Black men's clubs did not accept Black women as full members, and white women's clubs seldom accepted Black women at all, the Women's Era Club accepted everyone, male or female, Black or white, that wanted to join. The development of a network of Black women's clubs was important to the identity and political activism of elite and middle-class Black women. The journal allowed Black club women to share in their struggles, challenges, and work. It gave Black club women an outlet to express their ideas and to vocalize their displeasure. The clubs also contributed to stratifying the Black community by class and education. Most members were at least middle class. Some clubs may have been more elitist than others as well, but for the most part, Black America was building itself anew and creating a new post-emancipation Black identity. The Black Women's Club movement was a means to create, promote, and sustain a collective Black consciousness. Middle-class Black America's psychological and social development rested on having already achieved the basic needs of survival. As a result, elite and middle-class Blacks had the opportunity to engage the larger society in more complex ways beyond providing food and a table to place it on for their families. Like-minded individuals needed one another's company to exchange ideas and to support each other in the construction of a new, albeit small, Black middle class in the United States. A collective racial and gender consciousness was the first step towards building a coalition of like-minded activists. The Women's Era Journal, by linking Black women's clubs, expanded the members' public voice. The small numbers of elite and middle-class Blacks in the nation were strengthened by the publication, which provided access to news from across the country. Indeed, not all the news was political. Like other women's magazines and journals of the era, the Women's Era had a variety of columns that were of interest to all types of women. These columns included articles on domestic science, social news, women in business, etiquette, poetry, and short stories. In addition, the journal provided news from clubs across the country and political commentary on suffrage, lynching, the denigration of Black women, and equal rights. The Women's Era filled a void left open by other Black newspapers. No other paper focused on the needs, work, and politicized desires of elite and middle-class Black women. Ruffin and Ridley, in their editorial greeting, addressed this issue. The need of such a journal has long been felt as a medium of intercourse and sympathy between the women of all races and conditions. Especially true is this, of the educated and refined among the colored women, that which prevents her from making the most of herself and taking her legitimate place among the advanced women is the limitations of her surroundings and the circumscribed sphere in which she must move. The impossibility of mingling freely with people of culture and learning, and so carrying on the mental growth begun in schools and colleges, shuts her out of physical touch with the great world of art, science, and letters, which is open to all other ambitious women. The purpose of the journal was to be a clearinghouse of information, a catalyst for social change, and a means to engage like-minded women throughout the country. But the needs of elite and middle-class women were paramount. The journal was intended to continue the intellectual development of Black women in the process of creating a post-Reconstruction era group identity through the Black Women's Club movement to further their political activism. Black women in Boston were not alone in believing women should not be constrained by their gender. Laura Ormiston Chant of England, a guest lecturer at the first public Women's Era Club meeting in 1894, encouraged club women to get out of the home, to meet together, and to learn from one another. In the spirit of a true blue stocking radical, she suggested that not all women, quote, are intended for mothers. Some of us have not the temperament for family life. But that should not lead women to mourn their fates, because clubs will make women think seriously of their future lives and not make girls think their only alternative is to marry. Most Black women, of course, did not have the option of choosing to stay within the private sphere. They had to work to support their families. Ruffin and Ridley followed the open door policy they initiated with the Women's Era Club with the Journal. Ruffin declared, "Let it be said that the Era is not a colored paper. It is a paper whose managers and editors are colored, but the paper is open to all and hopes and expects in time to employ writers who are the best of their kind, whether such writers are Black or white." The club women were also certain that their work was preparing them for a larger role in society. Mrs. N.F. Mossett, writing the Open Court column, declared, "Shall we not prove by our own work for the women's era that during our years of apprenticeship, we did indeed learn to lead?" The Black Women's Club movement in the women's era allowed Black women to serve a broader apprenticeship in their development as full citizens, while creating space for the development of a collective Black consciousness. In one pro-suffrage editorial, Ruffin and Ridley were clear that they did not believe women were inferior to men, and even lambasted those who believed the Bible was an authority on women's place in society. Boston's elite women were likewise clear in their desire to not only uplift all Blacks, but to uplift Black women in particular. They recognized women were different from men, but did not accept this difference made women incapable of acting in the public sphere. Black club women wanted Black and white women to be active in the public sphere, to make the country a more moral place for all. By 1895, Ruffin, a veteran of the abolitionist movement and well aware of the failure of moral suasion in ending slavery, did not believe that moral suasion alone would be an effective means to halt Jim Crow. Ruffin felt relatively safe in the North, where she wrote, quote, "The spirit of the times is felt, but where a Black man is a man." Ruffin was cognizant of the Jim Crow sensibilities that had already spread to Boston. Black protests did slow the progression of Jim Crow in the city, but not in the South. Southern Blacks, according to Ruffin, remained powerless against the overwhelming odds arrayed against them, and thus Black males could not fully realize their manhood. Their best hope, felt Ruffin, was to leave the South. Quote, "The time for resistance, wise resistance, has come. Our hope for creating public sentiment grows dimmer and dimmer, and patience and humility cease to be virtues." Ruffin's earlier work with the Boston, Kansas Relief Association for Black Migrants, an organization that helped Blacks leaving the South for Kansas, certainly affected her opinion as to what Southern Blacks should do to defend themselves against white terrorism and discrimination. But the tone of her editorial also shows a great sadness as well. She no longer believed whites could be moved to honor Black citizenship. That special time that undergirded Black triumphalism at the conclusion of the Civil War was indeed over by the end of the 19th century. Ruffin called for resistance, albeit wise resistance, as an acknowledgement that Blacks, even Black elites, had lost patience with racist white retrenchment. What was wise resistance was left undefined by Ruffin, who bridged two eras, one of great sacrifice and triumph, and another of growing despair. Ruffin understood that respectability alone offered Black Americans few, if any, tangible benefits. In an editorial criticizing a racist speech given by a white guest, a Mr. Donald, during the Tuskegee Institute's commencement ceremonies in June 1895, Ruffin wrote that she did not expect an open protest from Tuskegee as she would have expected had the speech been delivered in Boston. The Reconstruction era was undergoing a revision that depicted Blacks as unworthy of citizenship and Southern whites as the victims of Northern aggression. Ruffin condemned Donald's speech, but her tone in this editorial was angry. The politics of respectability was proving insufficient in stemming the growth of anti-Black sentiments, spurred by a racist revision of the nation's history. Something had to change, and change soon, if Jim Crow was to be halted and reversed. Ruffin linked the growth of Jim Crow's sentiments in the North to the problems faced by the Black elite and the failure of the politics of respectability to protect elite and middle-class Blacks from discrimination. Quote, "It is useless to blind ourselves to the fact that our position grows worse. We progress in education and character and in the acquisition of money, but while in some cases these must tell, they do not bring that universal respect that they should." The trappings of respectability had, for some ethnic whites, allowed them to be accepted by the white middle class, but Blacks remained locked out. Quote, "As long as he is identified with the race," Ruffin continued, "the Negro is regarded and treated as an inferior except in individual cases. Boston's elite blacks did not need to read tea leaves or consult with Madame Cloud, a Boston spiritualist who regularly advertised in the women's era, to understand the effect of a rising South on black rights throughout the country. Ruffin's and Ridley's concerns on the eve of the Jim Crow era appeared to have no other solution than self-defense. They wrote in one editorial that we must acknowledge that there is nothing left for us but to strike for ourselves. We have a few staunch friends, but only a few. And even public sentiment, at its best, is bored with us. Elite blacks in Boston continued to press for federal intervention to halt the spread of Jim Crow, but their trust in the party of Lincoln was waning. Quote, "We can no longer wait for the problems to solve itself," they continued. "Away with the doctrine of humility. If extinction awaits us finally, let us go meet it like men, not lie down for it to overtake us." Ruffin and Ridley were putting out a call for action. Liberation could only be won if all, men and women, were willing to face the consequences of demanding full citizenship rights. Ruffin and Ridley believed black men had failed to protect black rights and hoped that black women, through a national black women's organization, would be more successful in combating racial discrimination. The 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision, resulting in the separate but equal doctrine, invigorated this call for action against racial discrimination. Ruffin and Ridley noted that the decision was not a surprise. Racism was on an increase throughout the nation. Many of these new attacks followed blacks as they acquired education and wealth, setting up barriers to prevent more than just a small percentage of blacks from bettering themselves. In time, they wrote, "The problem must work itself, and in the meanwhile, the Negro has got to make himself felt." They also admonished blacks that did not defend themselves. Quote, "There is no wisdom, virtue, policy, or manhood in bearing everything put upon one. Appeals for justice by voice and pen go very little ways at present. Practically no attention whatever is paid them. The time has come when they must be backed by aggressive action and a physical as well as mental resistance to every abrogation of manhood rights." The Plessy decision, virtually overnight, ended what little trust elite blacks had in the federal government. The decision betrayed not only Black Americans, but also the Constitution and the nation's democratic principles. Ruffin and Ridley wrote that, quote, "If laws are unjust, they must be continually broken until they are killed or altered. The thing to do is to force the recognition of manhood by any and all means." Clearly, they and other elite blacks felt they were under threat of at least a virtual extinction and the abrogation of their collective citizenship or manhood rights. As this threat to their citizenship grew, Ruffin and Ridley abandoned diplomacy and demanded action. This they believed the white men of the South would understand. Quote, "The heroes of the South who are meeting cowardly lynchers with a shotgun and the courage of true manhood," they wrote, "the men of the North as well as the South who are meeting insinuations against character and efforts to humiliate them with a strong and ready fist are doing as much towards the forcing of a right condition as any." Ruffin and Ridley challenged black men to take up the fight and be men, while challenging black women, their readers, to consider adopting the same approach. Their anger appeared to be evenly split between the Plessy decision and black men not willing to take up the shotgun and the fist to defend their rights. Quote, "The world is turning a callous ear to appeals for justice. It is evident that the only way now to get what we want is to take it, even if we have to break laws in getting it." Ruffin and Ridley by 1896 had little patience left for addressing the violence and discrimination against blacks by moral suasion. They were taking their white gloves off and extolling the virtues of the boxing glove. Acquiescence and accommodation would be the death of blacks in the United States. But Ruffin's and Ridley's anger fell on deaf ears. An armed rebellion would have hastened black extinction. It was no more viable solution to Jim Crow than was John Brown's attack on Harper's Ferry was to ending slavery. A coalition was needed of blacks and whites, as in the abolitionist era, to address Jim Crow. The near-total absence of white support for the anti-lynching cause was yet another reason why Ruffin and Ridley believed in forming a national organization of black club women. They had called for a Congress of Colored Women's Clubs in the first edition of the Women's Era Journal and suggested that Washington, D.C.'s Colored Women's League, led by Mary Church Terrell, take the first step in creating such a Congress because of the size and location of Terrell's club. Terrell did not do so at the time, leaving it to Ruffin, Ridley, and the women of the Women's Era Club to carry out this charge. The Women's Era continued to advocate for a national convention of Black women's clubs to press for civil rights in every edition of the journal. Clubwoman Josephine St. Yates wrote that quote, organization or military advance is the first step in nation-making. The clubwomen were promoting the development of a new Black consciousness and Black nationalism through their clubs in the Women's Era to protect the nation's fragile democracy through the collective voices of those pushed to the margins of society. Quote, how can these aims be properly defined, Yates asked, unless it is brought about by calling a Congress of women of nobility of soul and of wide experience in practical affairs? By all means, let us have a Congress of colored women. Ruffin Ridley and other Black club women believed they could create a nation that included Blacks as full citizens. Boston was the logical choice for such a meeting at the time. The city was still the most open city regarding race in the country, and convention attendees were least likely to be molested on the streets of Boston than elsewhere in the nation. The galvanizing impetus to form a national organization of Black clubwomen came from a letter written by James W. Jacks, president of the Missouri Press Association and son of an ex-slave owner. He sent the letter to Florence Belgarnet, the Honorable Secretary of the Anti-Lynching Society of England. Belgarnet was an admirer and supporter of Ida B. Wells and her efforts to end lynching in the United States, and Wells' anti-lynching protest in the United States was beginning to show some results. Beginning in 1893, the number of reported lynchings in the South was decreasing annually, but her success was also met by an intense media campaign against her. Jack's letter proved to be too much for Ruffin and Ridley and others to ignore. In his letter, Jacks questioned the morals and character of all Black women. Belgarnet immediately sent a copy of the letter to the Women's Era. It was this letter, according to Ruffin and Ridley, that precipitated their renewed call to hold a conference of Black women's clubs. Jack's letter convinced elite Black women that whites did not accept that any Blacks could be respectable. The Jack's letter was not only an attack on Black women, but also on the very notion of elite Black women's respectability. The National Conference of Colored Women was held in Berkeley Hall, Boston, from July 29th to the 31st in 1895. Margaret Washington, Booker T. Washington's third wife, forwarded a resolution endorsing the work of Ida B. Wells Barnett. The Jacks letter was denounced, but was not the major focus of the conference. The women formed a committee to, quote, draw up resolutions on the Georgia convict system, lynching, and the Florida state law making it a crime to teach white and colored children at the same time, and among other issues. Ridley then proposed that a national organization be created, and Margaret Washington was elected president of the newly formed National Federation of Afro-American Women. Her selection was politic. It knitted together both the North and the South, and through her linked the new organization to Booker T. Washington and his growing political power in the nation. Ruffin addressed the conference and explained why they were meeting and forming a national organization. Quote, in the first place, we need to feel the cheer and inspiration of meeting each other. We need to gain courage and fresh life that comes from the mingling of congenial souls, of those working for the same ends. This was very important in a number of ways. The Black elite made up approximately 2% of the Black population and were spread out across the nation. Finding fellowship with like-minded women from similar backgrounds was a comfort and supportive of the women's work. Making community, creating networks, maintaining families, and preserving culture was still women's work. Bringing together women who represented so many others helped to affirm the work of racial uplift and sustain this larger community. Ruffin continued. Next, we need to talk over not only those things, which are of vital importance to us as women, but also the things that are of a special interest to us as colored women, the training of our children, openings for our boys and girls, what we especially can do in the moral education of the race with which we are identified. The prospects for the next generation were a great worry to Ruffin, and with good reason. Colleges were beginning to make it more difficult for Blacks to attend and live in non-segregated housing. Black elites might very well become extinct unless something was done to stop the erosion of Black rights. The loss of an educated and relatively wealthy Black stratum would effectively silence the Black community and hasten the erosion of Black rights. Quote, "Too long have we been silent under unjust and unholy charges," said Ruffin. "We cannot expect to have them removed until we disprove them through ourselves. It is to break this silence, not by noisy protestations of what we are not, but by dignified showing of what we are and hope to become, that we are impelled to take this step, to make of this gathering an object lesson to the world." That was their uplift theology. It was not a radical program. It accepted as fact that many Blacks were not ready for full citizenship and needed to be made model and moral citizens. And then, Ruffin hoped, white America would come to its senses and accept Blacks as equals. The Uplift Ethos was a middle step in a program to rebut white stereotypes of Blacks. Elite Blacks in particular desired to simply be judged by their merits and accomplishments, decidedly American ethos. This was for both personal and racial reasons. If whites could be taught to see more than just skin color and recognize the talents of the Black upper classes, then maybe they would not be so quick to condemn the entire race. The new year brought new attacks on Black rights in Boston that buttressed the need for creating an even larger Congress of Black club women. During a meeting at the Atlanta Congress, the National Colored Women's Congress reached a tentative agreement to merge all clubs together under one umbrella organization. The National Federation of Afro-American Women merged with Terrell's Colored Women's League and became the National Association of Colored Women in July 1896. The group still exists, by the way. Terrell was elected president, and Ruffin was elected the first vice president. During the same time in Boston, the Arnett case resulted in growing radicalism among the Black elite in the city. Bishop Arnett of the African Methodist Episcopal Church of Ohio was in Boston for church business and was refused lodging in 3 hotels on the account of his skin color. Stanley Ruffin, Ruffin's son, was a second-term councilman from the 9th Ward of the Common Council at the time. He presented a resolution denouncing the discrimination and demanding the district attorney take action. His resolution was successful and passed by the council. Stanley Ruffin was not alone in the Ruffin family in denouncing the growing Jim Crow sentiments in Boston. His mother also weighed into the fray. Ruffin wrote, quote, "Boston contains many people as prejudiced, as cowardly and bitter on the race question as can be found anywhere," opined Ruffin. But the Arnett case has proven what the ruling sentiment is. Moreover, the colored people will continue to go just wherever they please and feel assured that if a man is found bold enough to insult them, he will never do it more than once. Uplift may have been Josephine St. Pierre's Ruffin's official stance at the conference, but in Boston, Ruffin was clear that Blacks were willing and able to fight for their rights. In 1903, at the age of 61, Ruffin disbanded the Women's Era Club. The reason remains unclear, but evidence suggests that her and her daughter's growing radicalism was out of step with the uplift ethos of the less radical and more reform-minded NACW, National Association of Colored Women. Ruffin and Ridley extolled the right of Black men to violently defend themselves against physical attacks. They belittled petitions and resolutions as weak-willed attempts to protect Black rights. They advised Black women to be manly themselves in their struggles for Black equality. In contrast, Terrell, the president of the NACW, was in Booker T. Washington's camp, and Terrell's husband would later benefit from Washington's ability to influence Teddy Roosevelt in handing out patronage jobs to select Blacks. The NACW, the first national organization of African Americans predating the 1905 Niagara Movement and the 1909 founding of the NAACP, focused on Black education and uplift work and not the more difficult or impossible struggle of securing Black manhood rights in the early 20th century. Ruffin's and Ridley's earlier desire to build a national Black women's organization and have that organization led by Terrell was met, but the NACW drew its constituency from across the country, in areas far more violently racist than Boston. Racist violence and terrorism understandably constrained Black radicalism throughout most of the nation, and these constraints were reflected in the more reform-minded NACW. As a result, the NACW did not meet Ruffin's or Ridley's growing desire for and belief in physical radicalism in combating Jim Crow. By 1903, Ruffin and Ridley had severed their connection to the NACW, and they, along with other members of the Women's Era Club, though still active in their own reform work in the city, were not so clearly heard from again until World War I. As to what exactly silenced Ruffin and Ridley remains unclear. In 1901, William Monroe Trotter began to publish the Boston Guardian. The Trotter and Ruffin families were friends for many years. James Trotter, William's father, was a wealthy Civil War veteran and a strong black radical voice in Boston during George Ruffin's political lifetime. And William was a frequent guest at the Ruffin home. William Trotter's attacks on Booker T. Washington and the Guardian may have resulted in Josephine Ruffin believing that black radicalism in the city would be carried further by the next generation through Trotter's agitation and newspaper. But in 1903, Trotter also publicly scolded Ruffin for accommodating segregation in the city and demanding that women move over and allow men to lead. Ruffin defended herself, but the damage was done. Shortly after this incident, Ruffin disbanded the Women's Era. Now, why Trotter would attack Ruffin in the press without speaking with her privately is unclear. But Trotter did engage in arrogant and aggressive reporting and actions that often backfired in the early 20th century. Trotter may have taken exception to a woman who publicly scolded black males for not being manly enough in fighting Jim Crow. Trotter may have also found black women in the city too challenging of male prerogatives. Ruffin did not retire from public service when she disbanded the Women's Era. She helped found the Association for the Promotion of Child Training in the South, the Boston branch of the NAACP, and was affiliated with many other clubs, associations, and organizations during this time. Florida Ridley continued her involvement in community and activist work in the 20th century as well. Most notably, she participated in the local anti-lynching and women's suffrage movements. Speaking to the Brookline Women's Suffrage Association, Ridley said of women's suffrage, "The suffrage question is like so many other so-called questions. No question at all, if faced in its nakedness." Florida Ridley also supported the education and uplift of the Black community. She served on the council of the Robert Gould Shaw House, Community Center and Settlement House during its foundational years. Joining other Black women and community leaders, Ridley helped form the local Soldiers Comfort Unit, which became the League of Women for Community Service in 1919. In addition to Ridley's storied career as a rights activist, Ridley was also a writer. She was not the first writer in her family. Her father also penned a novel about an enslaved man escaping slavery who resembled himself, even though he, his parents, and grandparents were born free of enslavement in Virginia. The Ruffin family was also used as characters in Dorothy West's novel, The Living is Easy. Florida Ruffin Ridley's short stories also used her family as models for her characters. In Ridley's short stories, like her father's novel, Ridley's preoccupation with mixed-race characters was clear. Florida Ruffin Ridley's short stories featured two main issues, money and race. Ridley's manuscript Impasse, which was later published in the Saturday Evening Quill in 1928 under the title He Must Think It Through. In this story, a white lawyer who is perennially short of money is told by a black lawyer in his office building that he was eligible to inherit great wealth. The white lawyer needed this money because his wife and daughter spent his salary faster than he could earn it. But there was a catch. He was not the only claimant. He had a distant cousin who was to receive half of the inheritance. His cousin was the black lawyer who told him of the inheritance. The white lawyer, Mr. Fitz, discovered he was not only white, but also of African and Indian descent, just like Josephine and George Ruffin, Ridley's parents. Fitz was a member of Boston's White Society set, which was part of the reason he was often in financial difficulty. In order to stay in this set, he had to keep up with the consumerism of wealthier members. Fitz wanted the money, but he feared his wife and daughter would be ostracized if anyone found out the truth about his ancestry. At the end of the story, Fitz is left with having to make a tough decision. He must decide to either stay white and financially challenged or become black and wealthy. Wealth in the small elite black community in Boston did allow for the children of the elite to attend schools like Harvard and Wellesley and did provide access to Boston's elite cultural life. But skin color in the United States and Boston continued to serve as a constant reminder of one's place in the larger society. And there simply was not enough money available to escape being black, with all that meant in the late 19th and early 20th century. For Ruffin's daughter in Florida, who was born during the Civil War, being a member of the black elite in Boston and of mixed heritage, must have affected her in light of the subject of her short stories. Important as money and position were to the black elite, members of this set remained black, and that affected their sense of identity. For Ridley and her mother, that identity imbued them both with the desire to fight for everyone's equal rights. The end.
Thank you so much, Dolita. That was wonderful. I, for one, feel even prouder now to have the school named for Florida Ruffin Ridley. We are definitely open to questions at this point, and while the audience reflects on any questions they may have, I actually have one that I would love to ask to get us started. I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your sources and where you had to go, and I'm particularly interested if the where the Women's Era Journal is and if it's been digitized at all.
So for a lot of it was actually from the Women's Era, along with various secondary sources as well. And when I did the research, it wasn't digitized. I had to go to the public library in Boston and, to their microfiche, area and look at it the old-fashioned way, which in itself was a bit of a struggle because you couldn't find the paper in the regular index. But there was like one elderly person who had worked in the library for a very, very long time, who also happened to be African-American. And so I went up to him and I asked, I thought that this paper was here, but I'm not finding it any place. And he raised one finger, kind of went into the back and came out with this kind of red book. And in it were all the items that they had having to do with African Americans that for some reason was not part of the regular library to find. You had to know that this book existed and then be able to go through it in order to find that information, which I thought was a little strange, but so it went, at least somebody collected it all. Now I've since found, I think you can Google it, the Women's Era online or something along that line. And a school had digitized it. Well, actually kind of like retyped all the articles. But what you don't get from that is looking at the advertisements on the page, who bought ads for the paper and, recognizing, aha, this real estate firm is connected to this woman who's part of the Women's Era Club, and seeing like all of the various connections that people had, with one another. You don't get the same sense of like reading the short stories and the poetry and all of those kinds of things, let alone the more kind of women's magazine, stuff on how to be proper and how to dress appropriately and things along that line.
There's a comment in the chat from Barbara that the Women's Era can also be found at the Emory Women's Archives.
Okay.
Emory University. And there's a question from Barbara. Could you talk more about Ridley's and Ruffin's more radical life, the period after 1903?
Okay. Well, that's where it gets very quiet. I mean, this was a tough thing for me because I was working on my dissertation at the time I was doing, this particular research. They seem to just not be mentioned for a while. I went through the archives, family papers at Howard University, and over at Radcliffe, excuse me, had a bunch of things from at least the later club, the League of Women. But this 1903 period to the beginning of World War I, I could find very, very little information. So, I'm with Barbara. I would love to know more about, that period of time. And maybe today it might even be a little easier to find some things than it was back when I was, doing this research in the 90s. But I really couldn't find anything at all. So in the dissertation, as a result, I switched to William Monroe Trotter and W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, because, and this might be a bit of an answer to Barbara's question. In the 1890s, Black activist women were really blaming Black men for Jim Crow, for not doing enough to combat Jim Crow. And as you can imagine, there was pushback against that. And so there was this kind of internecine war going on between activist women and activist men. When Trotter comes out with his paper and immediately begins, basically getting in Booker T. Washington's face about his saying one thing in the South, a different thing when he comes up to Boston, in the North, there is this belief that, okay, the next generation can take over. I mean, particularly for Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin, she had been doing this for a very long, time. And William Monroe Trotter was a guest in her house. He was after the woman who would later become W.B. Du Bois's wife. They kind of had eyes on each other. Du Bois liked, the woman that he would later marry. I mean, it was like all these different things kind of going on. But, he was like this young guy. Trotter graduates from Harvard in 1895 with both a bachelor's and a master's degree in magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa. I mean, he was the orator for graduation with all of these great ideas about what he was going to do after he graduated, and then nothing. And it's that period of nothingness that happened to him where I think he felt a great deal of promise for his own life. Up until then, Trotter had gone to high school in Hyde Park, first in his class, blah, 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 goes to Harvard, does exceedingly well there, and then graduates with no job offers, at all. And so he turns to this newspaper, becomes radicalized, I think, in first really having to deal with racism and that kind of way. And yeah, I think for many of the women, it was sort of like, okay, he sounds the way we wanted to sound. Let him, take over. But the women were obviously still involved with stuff because he, basically told Ruffin to stay out of politics, in his first paper, and then later accused her of not being radical, enough, which was a whole other, protest. So we know these protests were going on because every so often he would comment, on them, but I couldn't find any other information to really, tell me more about what the women were thinking and, the various things that they were doing at the time. The white papers, as you can imagine, didn't usually pick up these, items as much as the black papers.
Great, thank you. We have a lot of questions. This is great. I'm going to try to take them in order. So one question, what is known about any descendants of the Ruffins and Ridleys?
So I tried, I'm not a great person to find all these different folks, but actually a couple of years back, I tried to see if I could trace, from Ridley's kids, Constance in particular, because I think the son didn't end up having children, to try to follow to see if there were any direct descendants left. And I didn't really get very much, very far in all of that. So if there are any, historians out there, that would be a fun thing to maybe to look up and see if you could find out more about the Ruffin family. I did find the White Ruffins, who probably owned George's family in Virginia way back when. And, for those of you who have seen pictures of the family, these are very light-skinned African-American people, which was generally the case for elites, elite blacks in America during that time and still today. These were the folks who were frequently the sons of and daughters of the white slave master who raped, of course, the mother, though sometimes they claimed, it was love. Hard to be in love if you're a slave to somebody, but, there you go. But, in some cases, these children would be sold into the Deep South because the wives of the slave masters didn't want to be reminded of their husband's infidelity. And in other cases, the family would send their sons and daughters up to Ohio or Philadelphia, New York, Boston, to get them out of the slave South and give them some money so that they could, start a business, be educated, that kind of stuff. So you had, kind of this more positive approach, and then this less positive approach in dealing with the children of rape. So for George L. Ruffin's family, not only was he born free of slavery, his parents were born free of slavery, and his grandparents were born free of slavery. But they still had the Ruffin name. And so, I'm pretty sure that the going to the grandparents' era, that the grandfather was probably the son of the slave master at the time. So you can still find white Ruffins, throughout the South. And I think recently somebody on HBO has the Ruffin last name, and I've been curious to know whether that was a person related to this person. And my partner, who grew up in Dorchester, she went to school with a young woman with the last name Ruffin. And so we were actually lately trying to figure out if she was, kin to Florida's brothers, potentially. So I don't know enough. That's about what happened to the future generations.
Sounds like a good project for a genealogist out there.
Exactly.
Question from Ruth: is your presentation available online? And I will just reiterate, we are hoping to put the talk on YouTube. It will take a couple of weeks given the library's staffing situation at the moment, but keep an eye out for that. She also comments, so proud to have been active in the naming of our new school, which is my elementary school alma mater. I had no idea what a mother-daughter team these women were.
Oh, very much so. Very much so. Well, you're going to have the talk itself online, so that should take care of it. I'm trying to see if I could find the person. Okay, so she's not asking for the paper itself, just whether it'll be available online. So, and you're taking care of that. Okay, good.
Question from Roberto: what happened to the Second Universalist Church of Brookline she had helped form?
You got me. Just so folks know, so a lot of the research for this talk came from my dissertation, because obviously I had already done that, and additional work was stuff I could get online. Because the COVID, I can't go into the archives. I can't go into the usual places I would, go to do some kind of more in-depth research. And with time being what it is, and teaching and all that kind of stuff, I know Rita knows all about it. Throw a funeral in there, as well. I've been somewhat limited in how far I can, go in some of these things. But I think these are things that certainly local Brookline folks, I mean, this might be a fun thing to do even for the library, to say, okay, let's find out where all these other folks have come. I know people ended up in Mount Auburn Cemetery, so at least we know where folks kind of ended their lives, in the Ruffin family. But it would be very interesting to know some of these other things, and might be even a fun project to do with the school and the library. Let's see what else is going on, and really have a much fuller, picture of the Ruffin family and Brookline and their legacy in the activism that they were involved in.
Yeah.
Is that a good way to get out of out of not knowing the answer to that one?
Very skillful, yes. I see there are some comments too that Ken Liss from the Historical Society has done a talk on the descendants, and that talk might even be on YouTube. Ken, do you know if it is on YouTube? And that some of George Ruffin's siblings were activists in different generations. Not too surprising that it kind of ran in the family. Yes, okay, Ken's going to share the link to his talk. Wonderful.
Great.
Okay, we have time for maybe one or two more. Greer asks, do you know anything about Ulysses Ridley's folklore activity? None
at all. Yeah, I really tried to find as much as I could about Florida, and since this talk was really kind of looking at how Black women restructured civil rights activism, not just in the greater Boston area, but really for the entire nation. I was ignoring all the various men. I have a whole section about George Lewis, the dad, that I had to cut out just because, we had to limit this in time. But again, another good project for someone out there to be involved in.
Yeah, sounds like our elementary students are going to be busy with research.
There you go. Yeah, I'm used to giving homework, not doing homework myself these days.
I skipped over a question from Catherine, and Dolita, I don't expect you to be able to answer this, but she was wondering, is Florida's home on Kent Street the main reason why she was chosen as a new name for the school over choosing Josephine, her mother? I don't know either enough.
I can,
go ahead.
I guess. Though I think the mother ended up with her daughter near the end of her life. Is that correct? Or when Florida moved to Ohio, right, Toledo, I think I may now be getting a little confusion over all the different people I've been looking up of late. All right, let's just start from the beginning and say, for the most part, Josephine did not really live in Brookline. This was really the daughter's thing. Josephine and her husband George lived in what used to be called the West End. Those of you who are older probably remember the West End. In Josephine's later life, she may have stayed with her daughter in Brookline. But I would think of Josephine as having a more of a Boston persona than her daughter. Boston should be doing things with Josephine St. Pierre Ruffin. I mean, there should be a statue. It's, I know I gave a lot of history that didn't specifically mention either mother or daughter, because I was trying to give a sense of how instrumental they were in really creating the Black rights movement of the turn of the last century. These were incredibly important, people for the kinds of activism that they were engaged in. And most of you will have maybe never heard of these people, except when the school was being named, after Florida. And the same thing has happened to Trotter. He's just now beginning to get a little bit more notice by historians. Same thing happened with W.B. Du Bois, who I think it was not until the 1980s where he was, kind of came back into people's notice that, these were all folks who were forgotten by history because of who wrote history and the work that they did that wasn't considered all that important. But particularly now, as we're going through Black Lives Matter and all of these various things, and I think finally a recognition of the work that Black women have done, not just for race-related work, but for the work for all women, for American democracy. I mean, really, holding on to a belief in what our Constitution, stands for, that we're just now maybe beginning to get a glimpse of not only the work that has happened in the past, but the continuation, the legacy of that work that has continued, into the present. If it wasn't for Black women, we wouldn't have had a civil rights movement in the 1960s. Most of the work they did still has not been really made mention of by historians who, of course, were into the big names, at the time, and those names were always, of course, male.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap up on that note. And, I'm so pleased that this timing worked out, because we're sort of carrying us forward from Black History Month right into Women's History Month. And of course, I'm sure we all agree that those months are limited in their scope compared to what we can think about and talk about year round. So thank you again, Dolita. We're so glad you could be here. And thank you everyone for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.
Thank you, everybody.